The phone rang at 4:15 in the morning, and my sister's voice was so thick and slow that for a second I did not know it was her. She got out one broken sentence. "Cal, he has been in Amos's desk all night, and he keeps asking me where," and then something clicked against the receiver and the line went dead. I called back 11 times. 11. The phone rang through to nothing over and over while I stood in my kitchen in the dark with my heart going like a winch under load. What do you do when the last person left from your childhood calls you half asleep and half afraid, and somebody hangs up the phone for her? My name is Calvin Doane. Folks out here have called me Cal since before I had whiskers. I am 76 years old, and I hauled lobster traps out of Spruce Landing, Maine for 51 years, the way my father did and his father before him. Before I tell you what I found at my sister's house that morning and what I found much later in a drawer on my own boat, do me one small kindness. Put in the comments what the weather is doing right outside your window tonight. Fog on the glass, heat you cannot sleep in, or a sky full of clean, cold stars. I read every one of them, and an old man on the coast of Maine likes to know what the night looks like where you are. This is a story about my sister May, and about a piece of paper worth more than every dollar it moved. I want to tell it slowly, because the parts that matter are the quiet parts, and because somewhere out there somebody is living the first chapter of this exact story right now and does not know it yet. I drove the 12 miles to May's place with my high beams cutting fog you could have spread on toast. May is my little sister, Marion, on her baptism record, but nobody has called her that since the Eisenhower years except her late husband, and he only did it when he was teasing. She is 71. She buried that husband, Amos Odell, in the second week of May, 8 weeks before that phone call. Amos was 81 and he went quick. A heart that had been fair weather for years finally quitting on him in the truck outside the co-op. And I will tell you more about Amos, because this whole story is his story too. The porch light was off when I pulled in. May never leaves that light off. The kitchen window was lit up yellow behind a curtain, and when I came up the steps, the front door opened before I could knock, and Garrett filled up the doorway like a piling. Garrett Odell is Amos's son by his first marriage, 49 years old, soft hands, good teeth, a vest like the bank men wear. He had moved himself into May's spare room 3 weeks after the funeral to help settle the estate, as he put it. He stood in that doorway at 4:40 in the morning, fully dressed, and smiled at me the way a man smiles when he has already decided what you are going to believe. "Cal," he said. "It is the middle of the night." I said my sister called me. He said she dials people in her sleep now, that I would not believe the calls she makes, that the doctor said confusion comes and goes with grief at her age. He said she was finally resting and it would be a shame to wake her. He did not move out of the doorway. And friends, I want to be honest with you about what happened next, because I have never been a man who settles things with his hands, and this is not that kind of story. I did not push him. I did not raise a hand. I am just built like my father was, and I have spent my whole life walking across moving decks, and I simply kept walking, and it turned out there was room to get by him after all. May was not resting. May was sitting at her own kitchen table in her nightgown with her slippers soaked through, as if she had been out on the wet grass, and her eyes came up to me slow, like headlights through that same fog. There was a cup of tea in front of her, stone cold. She said my name with a little question mark on the end of it, Cal, like she was checking her own answer. My sister taught 4th grade for 34 years. She kept the books for Amos's Wharf sharp as a tack right up until the funeral, and she looked at me that morning like a woman trying to read a clock through pond ice. On the counter sat one of those plastic pill sorters, the long kind, a week across and morning, noon, and night down the side. It was Tuesday. Half the week was already empty. Garrett came in behind me talking softly, the way you talk around a spooked animal, saying, "See, this is what I mean. She gets up. She wanders. She was out on the lawn at 2 in the morning and I had to bring her in." He put his hand on May's shoulder when he said it. I watched my sister flinch, just a little, just the width of a trap line. But I had known that woman since the day they brought her home wrapped in flannel, and I saw it. And past the kitchen, through the door to the little room Amos used as his office, I saw the roll-top desk standing open with every drawer pulled and papers squared into cardboard boxes on the floor, and the brass lamp still burning at going on 5 in the morning. "Estate work," Garrett said when he saw where my eyes had gone. "There is just so much paper when somebody passes. You would not believe it." I said no, I probably would not. I got May a warm cup and I sat with her until the sun came up gray over the spruce and Garrett hovered the whole time, pleasant as a salesman, and I drove home with my hands tight on the wheel. On the dash of my truck, where it has ridden since last winter, sat an old brass pocket compass, and it slid a little on the turn by the boatyard and knocked against the windshield like it was trying to get my attention. I am ashamed to tell you how long it took me to listen, Now let me back up, because you cannot understand what was happening in that house unless you know the people, and you cannot know the people without knowing the wharf. Amos Odell owned the last working fish wharf in Spruce Landing. His grandfather drove the first pilings before the town had a paved road. It is not much to look at: a long shed on a granite shore, a hoist, a bait cooler, a float where 6 boats still tie up and sell their catch. But it is deep water, it is town water and sewer, and it is the kind of shorefront that men from away drive past slow with their sunglasses down. The last parcel like it for 20 miles went to a fellow from Massachusetts who put up a house with 7 bathrooms. You can do arithmetic like that in your head, and so could Garrett. Amos married my sister 12 years ago, both of them widowed, both of them past the age where anybody expected it. I stood up for him at the wedding, in the same church where May and I were christened. He was my friend for 60 years before he was my brother-in-law for 12. We fished side by side through weather I would not send an enemy into. I have watched that man take a green stern man who cut his hand to the bone, wrap it with his own shirt, and give him a full share anyway. That was Amos. Slow to talk, square in his dealings, and stubborn about exactly one thing, which was doing right by the people who did right by him. His first marriage gave him Garrett, and I will try to be fair about Garrett, because fair is what Amos would want. Garrett grew up on that wharf hating every minute of it. Hated the smell, hated the hours, hated being the boy in rubber boots when the summer kids came through in boat shoes. Nothing wrong with that. The water is not for everybody, and Amos never held it against him. Garrett went south to Portland and got into one venture after another: a restaurant on a marina that folded, a charter outfit that folded, a partnership flipping cottages that ended with lawyers. Every few years he would come home for a weekend with a new vest and a new plan, and Amos would listen with his hands folded, and some money would quietly change hands, and the truck Amos was going to replace would not get replaced that year. And his first marriage gave him something else too, something better. A daughter. Tess Odell, 26 now, Garrett's own girl from his own failed marriage, raised mostly by her mother in Brewer, and every summer of her childhood she was out here on this wharf with her grandfather. Where Garrett hated the water, Tess took to it like she had gills. She is a marine diesel mechanic down in Stonington today, and a good one. Amos used to say she was the only person in the family whose hands worked the same language his did. The last time I saw the two of them together, she was flat on her back in the bilge of his boat swapping an impeller, and Amos was standing over her holding the light, proud as a rooster and pretending not to be. Tess and her father barely speak. Have not for years. Hold on to that, because it matters later more than you can guess. So that was the family that sat down to Amos Odell's funeral in May. And that was the family that his estate was about to drag, one piece of paper at a time, into the story I am telling you tonight. Because 8 weeks after we buried my friend, his son was living in my sister's spare room. Her pills were doubling, her phone was dying in her hand at 4 in the morning, and every drawer in that roll-top desk was pulled out into the light of a brass lamp. He was looking for something. It took me too long to ask myself the right question, which was not what has he found. It was what is he afraid somebody else will find first. 2 days after that, 4 in the morning phone call, I got my sister alone. Garrett had driven to Ellsworth on estate business, his words, and I watched his taillights out of sight from the co-op lot like a boy skipping school, and then I went up to the house with a bag of crullers from the Ebb Tide Diner, because crullers were May's weakness back when Truman was president, and some things do not change. She was better that day. That is the thing about what was being done to her, and I did not understand it yet. It came and went like weather. We sat at the kitchen table, and for half an hour she was May entire, sharp and dry and funny, asking after my knee, telling me the rhododendron was leggy and I ought to be ashamed. And then I asked her about the pills, and the weather moved in again, not in her mind this time, but in her face. Fear? Friends. My sister was afraid at her own kitchen table. She told me it in pieces. That after the funeral she could not sleep, which was true of me too, and the walk-in clinic over in Ellsworth had given her something small to take the edge off the nights. That Garrett had offered to manage it all for her, the prescriptions, the refills, the little sorter, because you have enough to carry, May. That the pills looked different lately. That there were more of them. That when she asked, he had a printed sheet from the pharmacy and a voice like warm oil, and she came away from every one of those conversations feeling smaller and dumber and had stopped asking. That her telephone had quit working right. The handset gone from the cradle for days, her address book missing from the drawer where it had lived for 30 years, that her friend Alma had stopped by twice and been turned away at the door. Doctor's orders, he told Alma. She needs her rest. Then she took my wrist with both hands, and her hands were cold, and she said the thing I had driven out there to hear and was still not ready for. Cal, she said. In his last month, Amos was writing something. Nights, at the kitchen table, in his own hand, slow as church. He would cover it with the newspaper when I came in, like a boy with a valentine. And a few days before he died, he sat right where you were sitting, and he patted my hand, and he said, "It is fixed, May. It is in hand. Do not worry about the wharf, and do not worry about Tess, and do not you ever worry about a roof over your head. It is in hand." "And Cal," she said, with her eyes clearing all the way for one terrible second, "Garrett has torn this house down to the studs looking for something, and I do not think he has found it, and I am afraid of what happens to me on the day he does, or the day he stops looking. I want you to sit with that sentence the way I had to. The day he stops looking. Now, you are probably shouting at whatever you are listening to me on. Call the police, Cal. Call them right now. Friends, I did better than that. I'm a careful man, and this is exactly the part of the story where careful matters, so let me tell you how that call went, because if you are ever standing where I was standing, you deserve to know what the law can see and what it cannot. A young deputy came out, polite as you please, hat under his arm. He talked to May, who was foggy again by then. He talked to Garrett, who was magnificent. "I will give the man that, the way you give the weather its due even when it is drowning you." Garrett had a folder. Prescription printouts, every bottle photographed, a sheet from the clinic with a doctor's signature, a notebook where he logged her confused spells, dated and timed in a tidy hand. He had signed her in at the clinic himself, he explained, because Dad's passing hit her so hard, and here is the medication list, officer, and here is my number, and we are managing it as a family, and honestly the hardest part is her brother who means well, but who upsets her terribly with these ideas. And the deputy stood on the porch with me after and said kindly, "Because it was true, sir. There is no crime here that I can see. The medication is prescribed to her. She is in her own home. Her stepson is her caregiver, and there is paperwork saying she agreed to that. Confusion in a grieving widow of 71 is not evidence of anything. If you believe she's being neglected or exploited, you can make a report to Adult Protective Services and I will note the visit. He was not wrong, and he was not lazy. The machine is just built for wounds you can photograph, and what was being done to my sister did not leave that kind of mark. The paper was all on Garrett's side because he was the one writing the paper. I made that report to the state the next morning. Adult Protective Services, the elder abuse line, all of it. I am telling you the truth when I say it helped, later, in ways I did not foresee. And I am telling you the truth when I say that nothing about it was fast. Because the state of Maine has a great many old people and a great many worried relatives, and a caseworker with a stack of files does not gallop. But before any of that, the same week as the deputy and the porch, I made my first real mistake. I confronted Garrett myself, head-on, in the dooryard, with Pastor Linnell, not 30 feet away, helping Alma carry a casserole she was not going to be allowed to deliver. I laid it out flat. The way you would tell a man his bait has gone off. The pills, the phone, the desk, all of it. I said, "I know what you are doing to her." And Garrett took it like a man being handed a gift. He did not get angry. He got sad. Sad, slow, and loud enough for the pastor to hear every word. He said, "Cal, I know how this looks to you, and I am so glad you love her this much, truly." Then he answered every single thing I had said, in order, like a man laying down trump. The pills, adjusted twice by the clinic, here is the paper. The phone, replaced Tuesday, here is the receipt. She keeps unplugging the new one, ask her, "Oh, that is right," she will not remember. The desk, probate, Cal, there is a court, there are deadlines, somebody has to do this and I notice it is not you. And then, softer, with the pastor drifting closer, the part that cut. "I think you are grieving Amos too, Cal. I think you are lonely since your own wife passed. And I think May is all you have left, and this is how it is coming out of you. There is no shame in it. But please do not make her last good years a war." Friends, I stood in that dooryard and I doubted myself. That is what shame does. It comes up through a crack and floods the whole bilge before you know you are holed. I drove home and sat in my truck a long time. Maybe the clinic had adjusted the pills. Maybe grief does this. Maybe I was a lonely old man building a story out of fog and everybody could see it but me. He was that good. I want you to hear it plain, because somebody listening tonight has a Garrett in the family, smooth as new paint over punky wood, and I want you to know that doubting yourself in the face of a performance like that does not mean you are wrong. It means he is rehearsed. What pulled me out of the doubt was not a clue. It was arithmetic, the kind Amos taught me between strings of traps. "Boys," he used to say, "watch what a man spends his effort on, never mind his words." And Garrett was spending effort in 3 places. Keeping May cloudy, keeping visitors out, and going through paper night after night, box after box. You do not spend effort like that to care for a widow. You spend it to beat a deadline, and the deadline had a name and a face. That same week, a big gray pickup, too clean for our road, started appearing at the wharf. A development man out of Portland with a firm whose name you would know if you summer around here, walking the pilings with a tablet, photographing the hoist, pacing off the shed. I sat in the co-op lot and watched Garrett shake his hand like they had met many times, and watched the man's eyes travel up the shoreline the way a gull's eyes follow a bait barrel. Then, on the Sunday, Garrett stood up after church in the fellowship hall with coffee in a paper cup and told half of Spruce Landing his good news. He'd found a wonderful place for May. A memory care residence up toward Bangor, brand new, gardens, nurses around the clock, the works. Just as soon as the estate settled, of course. It broke his heart, he said, but we have to face where this is heading. He said it with his hand over the actual location of his actual heart. And my sister, who 6 days earlier had gripped my wrist at her kitchen table and asked me what happens on the day he stops looking, stood beside him with a cup of coffee she had not touched, fog-eyed in front of the whole congregation, exhibit number 1 in her own committal. I did not sleep that night. Sometime toward morning I stopped trying, and I did what I have done my whole life when the land stops making sense. I went down to the boat. My boat is called the Nella June after my late wife, and she has not hauled a trap in 4 years, but I keep her painted and I keep her pumped because a man has to have somewhere to sit. I got down to the float at first light with a thermos, and I climbed aboard, and the eastern sky was doing that thing it does in July, pink coming up under the fog like a lamp under a bedsheet, and I sat in the wheelhouse, and I let my mind go slack for the first time in 3 weeks. And my eyes came to rest on my truck up in the lot, on the windshield, on the little brass shape sitting on the dash, catching the first of the light. The compass. Amos's pocket compass. And friends, the morning went very still because all at once I was not sitting on my boat in July. I was sitting in the back booth of the Ebb Tide Diner in January, 6 months before Amos died, watching my oldest friend slide that compass across the formica with 2 fingers, and I heard him, plain as goals, saying the thing I had been too thick and then too grief-scattered to remember. Here is what happened in that booth, and I will tell it exactly, because I have gone over it in my mind 100 times since. Amos had asked me to breakfast on a Tuesday, which was odd, because we never made appointments, we just found each other. He ate his eggs, he talked about bait prices, and then he wiped his hands careful on the paper napkin, and he took out the compass, and an envelope, a plain white envelope with a strip of black electrical tape over the flap, which was pure Amos, a man who did not trust glue he had not supervised. He said, "Cal, I want you to keep 2 things for me. The compass is yours. I am giving it to you now. It was my father's, and you are the only man left alive who remembers his boat. But the envelope you are just keeping. Put it in the chart drawer on the Nella June and forget about it. If nothing ever happens, I will ask for it back someday and we will laugh. And if something happens to me, you get that envelope to Eleanor Weeks in Ellsworth. Not to the house, Cal. Not to anybody at the house. To Eleanor." And I laughed at him. God forgive me, I laughed, and I said, "What is this, Amos? Are you in trouble with the Coast Guard?" And he smiled the way he did, with the weather all staying up in his eyes, and he said the only thing he ever said about it. He said, "A mooring does no good on deck, Cal. It has to be down in the dark doing its work before the wind comes up." Then he talked about bait prices some more, and paid, and left the dollar under the plate like always, and 4 months later he was gone, and the envelope had gone clean out of my grieving head. It had been riding not 30 feet from me every day of that whole rotten summer, in the chart drawer of the Nella June, underneath the tide tables, exactly where I had shoved it in January. I am going to stop right here for one moment, friends. If you have ridden with me this far, and if you have ever been the one person in a family who had to stand up slow and quiet for somebody who could not stand up for themselves, then do an old fisherman a kindness and press that subscribe button, because those are the only stories I know how to tell, and I would like to tell you the rest of them. Now, the envelope. My hands were not steady, and I am not ashamed of it. I peeled that electrical tape off, and I unfolded 3 sheets of lined paper, the yellow legal kind Amos kept on a clipboard for his catch tallies, and I knew his hand the second I saw it. That upright, patient schoolboy handman of his generation wrote because a nun in Machias had once broken him of writing any other way. The first 2 pages, dated in April, 7 weeks before he died, said in words, "I will carry to my own grave. This is my last will. I am writing it myself, of sound mind, and I revoke every will that came before it. The house and the wharf and everything in the accounts to my wife Marian Odell outright, hers and nobody's business. The boat, the traps, the gear, and the truck to my granddaughter Tess Odell because her hands speak the language. And then a line I had to set down on the chart table and walk away from and come back to before I could finish it. To my son Garrett, I leave my forgiveness and the truth, which he already knows I know. Signed, Amos Odell, in that same upright hand, with the date and beneath it, smaller. They will tell you a handwritten will is a poor tool, and they are right, but a poor tool in time beats a fine one too late. Fix it proper, Eleanor. The third page was not part of the will. The third page said, Cal, if you are reading this, I am sorry for the trouble. Look after May. The boy has his mother's weather in him, all charm out ahead of a front. Do not fight him with your hands or your voice. Fight him with this. And Cal, tell Tess the impeller lasted. I sat in that wheelhouse and I cried like a man half my age, and then I did exactly what my friend told me to do. I did not drive to May's house and wave those yellow pages under Garrett's nose, though everything in my chest wanted to. I put them back in the envelope, and I put the envelope inside my shirt, and by 8:30 I was sitting in the waiting room of Eleanor Weeks's law office in Ellsworth without an appointment, holding my cap, with the compass in my pocket like a hot coal. Eleanor Weeks had done Amos's paperwork for 30 years, and her father did it before her. She read those 3 pages twice through, not fast, and then she took her glasses off, and she said, Calvin, I am going to tell you 3 things, and I need you to hear all 3 before your heart runs off with the first one. Thing 1, she said. Maine law honors a will like this. If the signature and the meat of it are in his own handwriting, it does not need witnesses. It is called a holographic will, and knowing that man's hand the way I do, this is one. He had an appointment with me for the 3rd week of May, Calvin. He was coming in to do it properly, belt and suspenders. He died 9 days short. This paper is the belt, and I promise you it can hold his trousers up in a courtroom. Thing 2, the estate is already open. Garrett filed the old will, the one from the 90s that leaves everything to him, drawn before Amos ever remarried, and the court accepted it the simple way, what we call informal because nobody stood up to say different, and he has had himself appointed personal representative, which means right now, today, he is the one with legal authority over your best friend's wharf. This paper changes that, but not by itself and not overnight. We petition the court, we go the formal route, a judge, notice to everybody, the whole procession. And we ask the judge to tie the personal representative's hands in the meantime so nothing gets sold out from under us while we argue. Thing 3, she said, and she folded her hands on top of those yellow pages like a woman guarding a plate. The moment we file this, Garrett knows it exists. And a man who has torn a house apart looking for a thing behaves one way while he is still looking, and another way entirely once he knows the thing is found and in the hands of a lawyer with a date on it 7 weeks before his father died. Cornered is not calmer, Calvin. You need to get ahead of what he does next. Now sit down and tell me everything about your sister and the pills, and do not leave anything out. So I told her. And by the time I got to the memory care residence up toward Bangor, Eleanor Weeks was writing on her pad in a hand so hard I could hear the point of the pen digging in, and what she said when I finished is the sentence that carried me through everything that came after. She said, he built his whole plan on one widow being foggy and one paper staying lost. This morning both of those went wrong on him, and he does not know it yet. She filed our petition on the Thursday. And on the following Tuesday, friends, Garrett answered us, not with a lawyer's letter, with a miracle. He announced to his lawyer, to the court, to half the fellowship hall that he had found a newer will. Typed, tidy, dated in March, 2 witnesses from Bangor, leaving everything, the house, the wharf, all of it, to Garrett Odell in trust to provide for the care of his beloved stepmother Marion. His father, he told the congregation with his hand on his heart again, had thought of everything after all. Even the yellow paper scribble poor Dad wrote in April made sense now, he said. Clearly by spring his mind was going, and the family had simply been too kind to see it. A typed will I had never heard of, dated 1 month before, the one writing inside my shirt that morning, dressed in every formality the yellow pages lacked. And 1 month is all it takes, friends. A newer date beats an older one. If that March will was real, everything Amos wrote in April with his own patient hand would still stand, because April comes after March. But Garrett was not presenting it as a rival. He was presenting it alongside a story, the story of a failing old man, so that the April pages would look like the ramblings of a mind already gone, and a judge might just believe the tidy type thing over the sad yellow scribble. That was the play. It was clever. It was so close to working. But Garrett had made a mistake. He had made it because of the one thing about that wharf he had never once done, which was love it, and it took me, of all people, exactly 11 seconds to find it. Eleanor got a copy of the March will inside the week, the way lawyers do, and she spread it on her conference table, and I put on my reading glasses, and I want you to understand that I am not a paperman. I have been outsmarted by an outboard manual, But you did not need to be a paperman for this. You only needed to have stood on Odell's wharf sometime in the last 9 years with your ears open. The March will was 2 typed pages. It read like a catalog. And halfway down the first page, in the middle of a sentence parceling out Amos's worldly goods, it said, "My fishing vessel, the Ellen Marie, together with all traps, tackle, and gear." The Ellen Marie. Friends, there is no Ellen Marie. There has not been an Ellen Marie for 9 years. Ellen Marie was the name on Amos's boat when he bought her from a yard in Jonesport, named for some other man's wife, and for the first few years he never got around to changing it, the way you don't. And then one October, on May's birthday, with a fair crowd on the wharf and a thermos of coffee royale going around, Amos painted a bedsheet banner and pulled it off the transom like a statue coming unveiled, and there was the new name in gold leaf he had paid a sign man in Belfast to do properly. The Marino. He did the paperwork too, every bit of it, because Amos did not believe in a thing until it was filed. And my sister stood on that float and laughed and cried and hit him with her hat, and every soul in Spruce Landing has called that boat the Marino for 9 years, because that is her name. No man on this earth writes his last will and testament and gets the name of his own boat wrong. Not that man. Not any man who ever loved a boat. You could sooner get your own child's name wrong. But a man in a hurry, typing in a lamplit office with a stack of his dead father's oldest papers for reference. A man who had not stood on that wharf for the christening because he had not stood on that wharf for anything. A man working off a yellowed insurance policy from before the remarriage. The exact vintage of paper that filled those boxes I saw stacked by the roll-top desk. That man writes Ellen Marie, because that is what the old paper in his hand said, and paper was all he had ever known of her. Eleanor looked at me over her glasses when I explained it, and she wrote 3 words on her pad, and I could read them upside down. Registered name changed. Because that was the beauty of it, friends. Amos had filed the name change 9 years back, all official, the way Amos filed everything. The town office knew her as the Marino. The state knew her as the Marino. The only place on God's green earth where the Ellen Marie still existed was in a drawer of dead paperwork and in the 2 typed pages of a will supposedly written by the one man who could never have made that mistake in March, when the real Amos was sitting at his kitchen table night after night, writing the true thing slow in his own hand under the newspaper. And once you knew to look, the March will could not stop confessing. Eleanor hired a document examiner, a retired fellow the courts up here have used for decades, and gave him 40 years of Amos to compare against, catch tallies, harbor committee minutes, the backs of photographs, and the man's report. When it came, said what your eye already suspected, that the signature was drawn, not written. Trace slow over a light source from a real one, the pen stopping and starting where a living signature flows. A signature, he wrote, is a habit, not a picture, and habits do not hold their breath. Then there were the witnesses. 2 names out of Bangor that nobody in Spruce Landing had ever heard spoken. Eleanor brought in a licensed investigator named Lyle Petrie, a dry, patient man who put 30 years into the Marine Patrol before he hung out his shingle. And Lyle did what good investigators do, which is not kick indoors, but read paper and not politely. Both witnesses, it turned out, traced back to the same address in Portland, a marina services company that had sued Garrett Odell over the folded restaurant and settled for a note he was still paying. One was the owner's brother-in-law, the other worked the fuel dock. 2 men who owed their livings to the man who held Garrett's paper, swearing they stood in a Spruce Landing kitchen in March and watched a dying fisherman sign a will nobody heard about until July. While Lyle pulled on that thread, the state got where it was going, the way the state does, slow and then all at once. The caseworker from Adult Protective Services turned up at May's door unannounced on a Thursday, a square-built young woman with a clipboard and the eyes of somebody's granddaughter, and she counted pills. That is all I will say about the mechanics of it. She counted what was in the sorter against what the pharmacy had dispensed, against what the prescription actually said, and the arithmetic was not Garrett's friend. And Eleanor, in the same stretch of days, had helped May do the simplest and bravest thing in this whole story. On a clear morning, my sister rode with me to her own doctor, her real one, the one who had known her 20 years, and she sat up straight and she said, "I want my medications reviewed, all of them, and I want it in writing, and I want my brother in the room while you do it." 14 days later, friends. 14 days of the right doses instead of the doubled ones, and my sister came back to me like a tide coming up a channel. Not all at once. A little more water every day. And on the 15th day, she sat at my kitchen table, not hers, with color in her face, and read the copy of Amos's yellow pages from first word to last, and put her hand flat on them, on his handwriting, the way you would put your hand on a man's chest. And she said, "Well, there he is. I have thought a great deal about why Garrett did not simply cut and run when our petition landed. Lyle Petrie answered it for me with 1 page from the Registry of Deeds. The purchase and sale agreement on the wharf, signed by Garrett as personal representative, 60 days to close, with the development company's earnest money already spent. I would learn later, on the lawyer, on the witness's goodwill, on the note in Portland that was past due again. The agreement had a drop-dead date, the second Friday of September. If he did not close by then, the deal died, and the money died with it, and the man in Portland holding his paper was not a forgiving man. Garrett was not fighting to win anymore. He was fighting not to drown on a clock everybody could read but him. So he did what drowning men do. He grabbed for the nearest solid thing, and the nearest solid thing was us. The last week of August, Garrett proposed through his lawyer a family settlement conference. No judges, no strangers, he said, just family at the fish house on the wharf Friday morning to resolve all outstanding matters amicably. His lawyer would attend. And, he added, as a gesture of good faith, a representative of the buyer would be there too, so the family could hear the offer plain, because, and this was the sentence that told me we had him, this was the sentence with the fear showing through the paint, there is real money on this table, Cal, life-changing money for everybody, including Tess, and it evaporates in 3 weeks, and I will not stand at my father's grave someday explaining why we let it. Eleanor read that letter twice and smiled like a woman being dealt the exact card she'd been waiting on, and she said, "He wants a room where he does the talking. Give it to him. Let him set the table, Calvin. We will just decide what gets served." And me, I called him back myself on the telephone, and I made my voice old. It is not hard. At my age, you just stop fighting it. I said, Garrett, I think a family sit-down is wise. I said, all this court business has me worn down to the rivets, and May just wants it settled, and I am too old to war with anybody. I said, I will even bring the coffee. He was warm as June about it, told me I would not regret being reasonable. And I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen and looked out at the fog on the water, and I said out loud, to nobody, to Amos maybe, the mooring is down, old friend. Now we let the wind come up. There was one more thing I did before Friday, and in some ways it was the hardest of all of it. I drove down to Stonington, to a boatyard smelling of diesel and copper paint, and I found a young woman in coveralls with her grandfather's chin, and I bought her a bad cup of vending machine coffee, and I told Tess Odell everything. About her step-grandmother's pills, about the paper her father had typed, and about 2 lines in her grandfather's own hand, one leaving her the Marion O, and one asking me to tell her the impeller lasted. She did not say anything for a long time. She looked out at the harbor with her jaw working, and when she finally turned around, her eyes were her grandfather's too, weather staying up in them, and she said, "What time Friday? That is all. What time Friday?" Friday came in clear and bright, one of those Maine mornings that make you forgive the whole month of March. I got to the fish house early and set up the big coffee urn like I promised, because I keep my word even to men who are about to have a very bad day. Garrett had dressed the place. I mean that. Folding table with an actual tablecloth, chairs in rows like a town meeting, a little easel with drawings of what the development company meant to build, all glass and gray shingle, with a name for it, Odell Landing, printed across the sky in letters like a memorial. His lawyer sat on one side of him with a briefcase. The development man sat on the other side with the gray pickup parked where the bait cooler used to run, and Garrett stood up front in his vest, warm and sad and reasonable, and ran his meeting, and I sat in the second row with my coffee and let every minute of it happen. He talked about facing facts, about poor May's condition, about what care costs, and how none of us was getting younger, and how Dad, and here came the hand to the heart again, how Dad would want the family whole and provided for, not feuding over sheds and pilings. The development man quoted his number, and I will not say it out loud even now, but it was the kind of number that makes church folk forget scripture. And then Garrett's lawyer slid the settlement papers down the tablecloth toward me and May's empty chair, and Garrett said, "All we need now is family peace." "Cal, where is May, by the way? I thought you were bringing her." And I said, "She is coming. She stopped to pick somebody up." And the fish house door opened, the big slider, full wide, the way it opens when a crew is bringing something heavy through, and my sister May walked into the light in her good blue coat, straight-backed, clear-eyed, 14 days of right doses and 60 years of spine. And beside her came Eleanor Weeks with a litigation bag, and behind the both of them, in clean coveralls, with her grandfather's chin set level as a rule, came Tess. I watched Garrett's face do arithmetic. I will remember it as long as I live. Charm to confusion, confusion to counting, counting to fear, and then, because he was Garrett, all the way back around to charm. "Tessie," he said, opening his arms. "Sweetheart, I did not know you were coming." She looked at him the way you look at weather on the horizon, and walked past him and sat down next to me. What happened next took 25 minutes, and Garrett's lawyer, to his credit, saw the shape of it before his client did, the way a good pilot feels the bar under the hull before the sounder says a word. Eleanor did not raise her voice. She dealt paper, one sheet at a time, the way I have described other people dealing it my whole way through this story, except now the paper was ours, and every sheet went down on that tablecloth facing Garrett turned so he could read it. 3 yellow pages, dated April, in a hand every person born in this town could recognize at arm's length. She read the whole thing out loud, slow. The house and the wharf and the accounts to Marian Odell, outright. The Marian O and her gear to Tess Odell, because her hands speak the language. And to my son Garrett, my forgiveness, and the truth, which he already knows I know. The room went so quiet I could hear the tide working under the floor. Then the document examiner's report, and Eleanor read out the sentence about a signature being a habit and not a picture, and laid a photograph of the March signature blown up big beside a real one, and even from the second row you could see it, the little hesitations, like a man walking on ice. Then 2 sheets on the witnesses, the settled lawsuit, the note in Portland, the brother-in-law, the fuel dock. The development man, and I want you to notice this, was already gathering his drawings quietly off the easel because money can read a room faster than anybody. And then Eleanor set down a single page, and she looked at Garrett kindly, which was somehow the worst thing anyone did to him that morning, and she said, "Mr. Odell, before we go further, in the will you filed with the court, your father devises his fishing vessel, the Ellen Marie." She let it sit. And my sister May, in a voice steady as a bell buoy, said the line I had been waiting 3 months to hear somebody say. "There has been no boat by that name in this harbor for 9 years, Garrett. He renamed her for me on my birthday, and he filed the change the same week, because that was the kind of man your father was. He never in his life got her name wrong. You only did because you never once looked up from the paper long enough to see her." Garrett said the bow was a typo. He said drafts get muddled. And then he heard it, the way the whole room heard it, that you do not typo a boat that ceased to exist 9 years ago. You copy it off an old insurance schedule, out of a dead man's ransacked desk, and his voice ran down like an engine out of fuel, and he sat, and the vest looked too big on him all of a sudden. His lawyer asked for a moment with his client outside. They were gone 11 minutes. Only the lawyer came back in and he spoke 4 sentences. I will summarize as gently as they were not spoken. He was withdrawing from the matter. The March will would be withdrawn from probate by day's end. His former client understood that the family's other materials, the pharmacy arithmetic, the caseworker's file, the examiner's report, were going wherever Mrs. Odell and her counsel chose to send them. And he wished, and here the man looked at me and meant it, that he had asked more questions in June. Through the window, I watched Garrett standing alone in the lot beside his father's hoist, and I watched the development man's great pickup pull out past him without a wave, taking the number and the deadline and the last plank of the plan away with it. There was a sheriff's detective parked across the road because Eleanor's packet had gone to the district attorney 2 days before. Forgery is not a family squabble, it is a felony, and the machinery of that was turning now no matter what anybody withdrew. But nobody laid hands on anybody that morning. Garrett got into his car by himself, small under all that August sky, and drove away from the only thing his father ever built, which had never once, not for a single day of his life, been withheld from him. That was the piece he never understood. All he ever had to do was ask to belong to it. The rest I can tell you quickly, because the loud part was over and the true part could start. The judge in Ellsworth took up our petition that fall, in a hearing that lasted less time than the coffee urn takes to perk. The yellow pages went in as Amos Odell's last will, proven in his own hand. May kept her house and her wharf. Garrett answered for the forged will in a different courtroom in the spring, and because May stood up, my sister, the woman he had fogged and folded and marched toward a locked ward, stood up in front of that judge and asked for mercy with conditions. He was sentenced to probation, restitution, and treatment for the gambling that Lyle's paperwork had found under everything else, the way rot is always under the paint. The truth Amos meant, we finally understood, was a ledger in the roll-top desk, decades of quiet money, loan after loan after loan, everyone recorded, everyone forgiven in a single line at the bottom in that patient hand. Paid in full, the day he asked me nothing more. May mailed Garrett a photograph of that ledger page while he was in the program in Bangor. She got a letter back in November, 4 pages, and she has not shown it to me, and I have not asked. But I notice she sets 3 places at Thanksgiving now instead of 2, just in case, the way our mother used to. The door is not open, friends, but it is not nailed shut either. That was Amos in her, I think. Forgiveness and the truth and the order matters less than you would think. Tess has the Marian O hauled out at her yard right now, refastening her. And in the spring, she means to fish her out of Odell's wharf. 6th generation of hands on that hoist, if you count the way I count. The first time she took the helm, I stood on the float and handed up her grandfather's compass, the brass one, off my dashboard at last, and I told her what he asked me to tell her, that the impeller lasted. And that girl in her coveralls held that little instrument like it was the crown of England, and she set it on the binnacle where it belonged, and she looked at it a long moment, and she said, "It still points where it points." And I said, "That it does, sweetheart. That it does, no matter whose hand it is writing in." Now, I promised you at the top that this story had something in it for you to keep, and here it is, and I will not preach long, because Amos would not. If you were of a certain age, and you have been meaning to get your affairs in order, hear me. A handwritten will save this family, and it very nearly did not, because it spent a whole summer lost in a drawer on an old man's boat. Some states honor a will in your own hand and some do not, and I did not know which kind mine was until a lawyer told me. Do not build your family's future on paper and luck and a forgetful old friend. Sit down with a lawyer who does estates, what they call elder law, and do it while you are strong and clear, because the paper you sign on a calm day is the mooring that holds everybody you love through the storm you will not be there to see. And whatever you sign, tell somebody you trust where it is. A mooring does no good on deck. Amos taught me that, and it cost him 9 days of margin to be right. And the second thing, and this one, is for the sons and the daughters and the neighbors. If somebody old in your life goes foggy fast, and there is a new helper standing between them and their own telephone, their own mailbox, their own doctor, their own friends at the door, do not let politeness talk you out of what you are seeing. Confusion that comes on quick has causes, and some of those causes come in a weekly pill sorter. Ask to see the person alone. Ask about the medicines by name, and if the answers slide around like fresh paint over punky wood, call your state's adult protective people. That is what they are there for, and be the one who makes the call. The deputy on the porch was right. The machine cannot see everything, so the machine has neighbors. That is you. My sister sat on my porch last evening. We ate crullers from the ebb tide and watched the fog decide against coming in, and the Merino swung easy on her mooring out there in the last of the light, riding a line none of us could see, holding fast to something set down deep in the dark long before the wind ever thought to blow. That is what love looks like from shore, friends. That is all a good life is. Set yours deep while the water is calm, and make sure somebody knows right where it lies. Good night from Spruce Landing, Maine. And if the weather outside your window is kind tonight, go stand in it a minute for me.